Michaela, do you want to take it away?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Michaela Leslie Rule. I am together with Meredith Fenton, who's also on this call. We are Fig Sass. We are communication strategists and narrative researchers, and we do a lot of work in this space, both for grassroots organizations that are doing, justice-centered work, and then also for some foundations that are trying to build and strengthen and support capacity building in this space. So this is our third, right, Meredith? This is our third?
Yes.
Okay. This is our third training in a series of 5. For you all, we're so glad that you're joining us again for this third one. Some of the faces that I'm seeing here and names are familiar. So I love that you're coming back and that you're finding that this is, interesting and helpful. If you haven't already, please enter into the chat your name, your organization, wherever you're located right now, and the main place that you're getting your news. And you may wonder, why are we asking you that question? Because the entirety of today's session is going to be focused on thinking about earned media and thinking about what we kind of think about now as more traditional media, right? Like newspapers and op-eds, and how do we work with journalists? How do we think about media strategy? So this is kind of a primer to get your heads in that space of thinking about the ways in which audiences look for information and sort of who our trusted messengers are, right? So thank you. I'm seeing in the chat all of these things. This is wonderful. You're engaged. Excellent. This is going to follow, if you've come to one of our trainings before, this is going to sort of follow a similar format. The way we do these is that we present a webinar that's about an hour and a half. So that's today. And then we follow it up with a series of 1-hour workshops where you all can dive more deeply into some of the content that we present. And those are pre-registration. So if you are coming to a workshop, you already know. So we'll see over the next day or so. I think it's tomorrow. We're doing all of them tomorrow. We'll see 12 of you at a time and talk a little bit about some of the specifics of working with the media. So as I said, today is our Working with the Media webinar. The next one that we do in April will be on digital engagement. And we have a colleague of ours, Mina Hussein, who's going to be joining us then. And she's just like a powerhouse, amazing mind about how to leverage digital for justice. And so we'll work with Mina then. You'll talk all about digital strategy. You'll talk about like, what does it look like to have a process for developing content? What do you want to put out there? Timing, all of those kind of good, juicy questions. And then as we have this week, you'll have workshops to sort of think through that with Mina and with Meredith and I. And then our final training was called The Power of Story. And for us, this kind of brings everything together. That's really our like wheelhouse, right? Mara and I spent a lot of time thinking about storytelling, how to be strategic in your communication, strategic in your stories that you tell, what to put where, the timing, how do you create a good story, all of that, right? So you'll think about that as sort of the capstone, if you will, on the training. And it has TBD because the date is moving around a little bit, but Shira will be able to reach out to you and let you know where we land on that. So that's it. And if you have any questions, feel free to enter them to the chat as we go along. But since there's 2 of us, we're pretty good about tag teaming about answering your questions as we go. And hopefully you'll come off mute a couple times too. So what's our agenda? We did a little welcome and introductions. We're going to spend a little bit of time doing some review about these previous trainings that we've done and how it sort of stacks up to today's training. We will do a warm-up activity. We're going to think a little bit about this idea of honing your strategy and sort of giving you all some more foundational ideas around working with the media. Per the usual, we have a worksheet for you, and we'll ask you to sort of dig into that a little bit at a time as we're going through the training. Let's see, we'll talk a little bit about earned media coverage. And then you'll do parts 2 and 3 of the media worksheet. And the idea is always that you're just getting a little touch, right? It's just a way for you to activate your mind around what we're saying and sort of put pen to paper or fingers to keypads, right? And start to just like pull the thread through, right, for your own work so it becomes or feels more actionable. We'll talk a little bit about particular media strategies that you might consider and how you sort of weigh and think through what's going to fit your organization best. And then we'll have some discussion, some Q&A, and we'll wrap up and we'll close. And then, as I said before, some of you will see tomorrow, and we'll be talking more about your press releases or whatever information you want to bring to us for us to talk through to mark up. Yeah. Next. So thinking about where we've been, I started out by saying that we've done a couple of trainings before this, 1 and 2. And in those trainings, we focused on communication strategy, thinking about what's the design of communication strategy, and then really importantly, thinking about audience and who's your audience. So we talked first about comm strategy in the first training. Then the second one, we kind of built on that idea. Once we have a target audience, what do we want to say to them? How do we craft those messages? So just a quick review. All of this work, communications is in service of something, right? So we're always starting from what is it that you want to accomplish either as an organization or potentially in some of your cases as a campaign, right? What is the goal? And then how are we going to use communications to support, right? Or to advance that goal? So starting with the goal, what do you want to achieve? We like SMART. Many of you have heard of SMARTs, right? Is it specific? Is it measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound, right? Is it SMART? Next is determining your audience and getting really specific about, who are the specific people that without this group of people, you will be unable to achieve your goal. And that's very different than saying, we're talking to everyone. We have a general audience, right? A general or public audience, the general public does not exist. Right? That's not an audience, right? So we got to get really specific about who actually do you need to persuade, to motivate, to neutralize, right? In order for you to accomplish your goal. And then we think about targeting your audience, right? So once we know who our audience is, we want to know how do we reach them, right? How do we reach them and how do they think about our issue? So some of these kind of not so much criteria, but some of the questions that you might ask yourselves is finding out what do they care about, right? So sometimes we have an issue that for us is meaningful for one particular reason, right? But our audience cares about it for a completely different reason, right? And we don't actually have to care about it for the same reasons. We just have to be able to get them to do what we want them to do, right? We want to be able to influence their behavior in a way that advances our goals. And the other part here that I think is important to lift up is what do they need to feel to take action, right? Like what do you need to make them feel in order for them to take action, right? So we work in service of evoking the emotional response, right, that we want people to have in order for them to feel compelled to take action. Next slide. So quick example of everything I just said, right? So starting with the goal in this example, it's securing enough votes to pass a bill in Sacramento, right? In order to pass a bill, who is the audience that you cannot pass the bill without? You need legislators, and importantly, you need their staffers, right? Staffers are the whisperers to legislators, right? And then you need to target your audience. So we need to think about where do staffers and where do legislators get their information, right? What is the place where they are becoming influenced around an issue or becoming knowledgeable about an issue, right? So we think about an op-ed in the Sacramento Bee, pitching to Capital Weekly, Rough and Tumble, a blog, etc. And then just as kind of a counter, we always want to kind of balance and acknowledge that you all are working in different contexts, right? So here's another one where the goal is to activate voters to pass a referendum on an upcoming ballot. So the voters, right? The difference is we're not talking about the legislators and the staffers, we're talking about voters, right? So first, which voters, right? Which voters are available to you, are available. We're not trying to push people that are like on the opposite side, right, as us, right? So progressive and moderate likely voters. We're trying to push people that are available in some way. How do we make them more available and how do we activate them? And then who are those folks listening to? In this case, the radio, right? Television and news, online news and outlets, right? You wouldn't put something in Rough and Tumble for progressive and moderate likely voters because they're not reading that blog. All right, so here we go. We want to start out with a warm up. And again, right, to kind of like locate this among all of you, we're going to put you in small groups of 2 or 3, and that'll be, we'll put you in Zoom breakout rooms. And we want you to think of a program goal or a campaign that your organization is working on right now or was working towards within the next 3 months, 3 to 5 months. First, walk through that piece, right? Who's your target audience? Who do you need to activate, persuade, or neutralize to meet your goal? And then think about the headline that you feel would activate your audience around your issue or your campaign or your political agenda, right? So think about if tomorrow morning you woke up and you felt like, yes, this is going to do it. What is the headline that you would like to see? And I want to use that kind of broadly. We're using the word headline because that's kind of our terminology right now, right? But this could be social media. This could be, online. It could be a newspaper where it's literally a headline, or it could be something else, right? But sort of like, what's the breaking news or the headline that you'd like to see? So we're going to jump you into a Jamboard. And we learned last time that we have to put the link in now, and then grab the link and make sure that you have it open, and then we'll pull you into groups. So Mare, how much time do they have? About how much time do they have?
Let's start with like 7 minutes. So this is just a quick brainstorm, right? Rather than it is like a full group presentation. It's really just to get your creative minds thinking, right? About how do you sort of connect from your goal all the way to that strategy of what would that headline you're going to be able to see. And no worries, I'm seeing some folks saying they're stepping away or driving. So we're going to open the breakout rooms. Jump in and do this if you can. If not, then we will come back together and we'll regroup. Okay. So we're going to go ahead again, click that Jamboard, and that's where you're going to put we're using a sticky. You can put the onto the Jamboard with your headline. A great question, Vincent. Yeah, think of a goal. Like it might be one that, because you're all doing similar work, it's an example of the kind of goal you might have. Or maybe somebody in your group has a goal that they're really excited about, and the rest of you all can be thought partners to folks in sort of how you would activate around that goal. You can kind of decide how you want to do it once you get into your small group. And I'm going to make the rooms about 4 people each. So that way you should each have at least a buddy to talk about this with, even if some folks aren't able to do the breakout. And
wait 1 second. 1 second. It says that they can't. Hold on 1 second.
Oh, I see we're having some troubles. Thank you, Lisa, for letting us know. We'll make sure that the Jamboard is accessible, and let's put it into the chat one more time just so folks can grab it.
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms, and we'll see you in about 7 minutes. Okay, welcome back. We know that some folks were having some morning tech difficulties, no worries. But we also know that based on the Jamboard, lots of you were starting to brainstorm a little bit. And so, Michael, I'm wondering, could you just read us a couple of the headlines that some of our small groups generated?
Yeah, I feel like this is a world I want to live in. Like if this is what the news looked like when I woke up in the morning, I would be pumped. It's Eel River Valley Partnership building a healthy community. Youth-led research study increases access and funding for youth mental health. Full funding was received for the tiny home village for homeless youth. Rent assistance for mothers, a demand. Bridge Builders Foundation is making a significant impact supporting higher education for African-American males. It's interesting, some of you youth radical self-care event, like some of you are thinking about what's the headline that is calling attention to the work that we're doing, and others as like the calling attention to work that's been completed. Visalia youth make healing part of their school day. Yeah, I think this is really rich. This is really, fentanyl declines throughout the state of California. These are really, really rich. And I think this is a good place for us to jump into the next chunk.
Wonderful. So we're going to really focus on, so what might it take to get those headlines, right? Those catchy headlines announcing the good news that sort of shows the impact of your work. And like we said at the beginning, today we're focusing on what's often called traditional media, or also often called earned media. And so what is earned media and traditional media? What do we mean by that, right? And you can see here that for most of us doing communications in service of the change we're trying to make, there's lots of different ways that we're trying to communicate with the good people of California, the youth we need, the policymakers we need, advocates, right? Depending on what you're trying to do. And really in the top left here, where we're going to be focused on in terms of earned media, that is the media in which you don't really have control over. You need traditional outlets to work with you as the channel through which you're connecting to your audience, right? So by that, we mean television, we mean newspapers, including community newspapers or cultural newspapers. We mean online outlets like blogs or online magazines. We mean the radio, right? And these all fit into the universe of communications that also include those things that you own, right? Like you might have your own blog on your own website, but that's a slightly different piece of sort of the media environment than if you're trying to get on sort of like a big public Huffington Post type blog, right? There's also the media that you might pay for, right? So using ads or advertising, right? That's not what we're focusing on today, right? And then there's the shared, right? Which is social media, which next month's session we'll focus on, right? And so, like Michael has said at the top, we always go back to that basic idea of, is this the right tactic for us? So how do you figure out, is media strategic? And again, it goes back to those goals. So often the types of goals that are strategic for using earned traditional media are things like influencing decision makers. Those might be local decision makers, statewide, federal, school district decision makers, whomever, right? It might be promoting an event, right? Getting folks out to a healing festival, I think was one of the headlines that we heard in the warm-up, right? It might be your organization has something to say and you want to share that thought leadership, right? So all of these types of goals can be really strategic for the media. On the other hand, just as a reminder, when it comes to, if your goal is just media coverage for the sake of media coverage, that is probably not a strategic goal. Ideally, you have a sense that that media coverage, again, is a pathway to reach your audience or influence who you need to influence. And that, as we know, there's no general public. And so it has to be a specific audience that you think this media outlet can reach. And most of the time, sometimes folks think, oh, if I can just get coverage in the media, that'll help me raise money. Most of the time, earned media is not your most direct channel to raising funds, right? But we can also dig in more to any questions folks have about that. So once you know what your goal is, then again, you go back to audience. So how do you know, is media a strategic way to target your audience, right? So one is, there's tons of research that talks about different types of Americans and where they get their news. And at the end, when we share our reading list, we'll have some of those resources, right? Folks have studied, where do young people get their news? Where do old people, where do rural people get their news, right? And one of the things we know that I also noticed as folks were checking in, a lot of people said, I get my news from social media, right? That is becoming increasingly true. A lot of folks are not daily subscriptions to their local newspaper anymore, or they're not nightly news watchers. Instead, they're using these other outlets as sort of their the conglomerate that's giving them their news headlines. A lot of people use Twitter, right, as their news feed, or Apple News or something like that. And then just as a reminder, most of the time, the media isn't your audience. They are just the tactic through which you reach your ultimate audience. The exception to that is if you're doing a campaign around how journalists cover an issue, right? So if you're actually targeting journalists to help them cover young people in a way that is more holistic or more realistic, right? Or more supportive of what you're trying to do, then the media can be your audience. But most of them, it's not going to be the tactic they're not going to be your direct audience. Then you need to think about, do I have something that can actually earn media? So we're going to talk in a second about what does it mean to be newsworthy, right? You also want to think about, do you have the capacity to have an earned media strategy? Often folks think, oh, great, all we have to do is pitch this story and then we'll be set. But they haven't actually thought about all the time it's going to take to coordinate spokespeople who are ready and willing and able to do interviews with the media. That is a heavy lift, right? And so wanting to make sure that you have that time, the capacity, and the right people can really help make sure that you're ready to start pitching the media. So how do you know if something is newsworthy? What you are trying to offer the media doesn't have to hit all of these buckets, but likely will hit one or more of them. So things such as, is it timely? Is this the moment at which media would be covering this issue? Often it can take us in nonprofits time to get our press materials together, but then what happens is we're sending a press release responding to something that happened a week ago. And unfortunately, the media cycle moves very quickly. And so a week later, they're not going to be talking about that thing anymore. It's not timely anymore. So you want to make sure that you're right at the right moment, timely. You might also be thinking about if you are working in a local community and there's a big national conversation about something in the national media, maybe you can provide the local angle, right? Everyone is talking about the mental health crisis of our teenagers. And here we are in our local community. Let us tell you how we're addressing it right here in our community. Things like that. You also want to think about, is it going to sound new? As if it's news. Is this new information, new data, a new angle, a new way of covering it? Because the media is always trying to think about, how are we offering our readers something that they haven't seen before and that they can't get other places? So these are just, again, some of those newsworthy tests that you want to make sure that you're passing before you start reaching out to the media. Then which media, right? There are so many different outlets, radio, TV, online outlets, as we said. And so the question is, which of those outlets are the best place to reach who you need, your target audience? And that audience, as much as you can get specific about it in terms of things like age, demographics, all of those things will help you make better choices about which outlets to pitch. You also want to think about, what assets do you have? If you don't have something that people can come with a camera to film, television is likely not going to be your best place to pitch. And then you want to think about what kind of press materials you might need in order to reach out to that particular outlet. And things such as, is this something where you're going to try to go and earn the media by pitching a story? Or is it something that might happen organically, where you're cultivating reporters so that they become someone who calls you every time they're talking about fentanyl in your community? They know, I'm going to this organization because I can rely on them to connect me to folks who can speak to the crisis and solutions to it. So with that, we want to give you a minute just to think about, how does media and media strategically fit into your goals? And so Michael is going to drop in a worksheet into the chat, and we're going to invite folks to go ahead and click on that. And we're just going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes to do some brainstorming. And again, this is just a light touch, right? We're not expecting you to fully and completely bake out your media strategy in the next 4 minutes. We just want to give you a minute to collect your thoughts. And so as you'll see in part 1 of this worksheet, it really is just a place to collect your goals. So these might be the same goals that you've articulated back if you've been part of our communication strategy webinar or the messaging webinar. Or it might be one of the goals that you shared about in your small group during the warm-up. But just to think about, how and why is media going to be strategic for your goals? And in order to be able to start filling it out, you need to make a copy of it, and then you'll have the access to edit it. So I'm going to pause the recording and just play a short little bit of brainstorming music, and then we'll keep it going.
All right, so coming back, we want to talk a little bit about the foundation, right? So as you noted probably in the worksheet, there's 3 parts to this part of the training, right? And one part is as Meredith talked about, is kind of figuring out if your communication is going to be strategic, right? The next piece is around really the media as a we've talked about media as being sort of the vehicle by which you reach your audiences, but they're also people, right? So we need to figure out how do we build a foundation that you can then like leverage, right? When something comes up, when you're ready to talk about something, that you've already established a foundation. So you're not reaching to establish those relationships in the actual moment that you want to communicate something. So one part of building a foundation is what we would call media monitoring, which is really for you to get a sense of the landscape of media in your space, right? Or media that is affecting your audiences or reaching your audiences. So having a sense of who the main reporters are across the different platforms that you might want to use. What are some of the dominant messages around the issue or the frames that are being used around your issue? So fentanyl is a good example of this. There's a sort of public safety and security frame for fentanyl, and then there's a public health frame for fentanyl, right? And those are used differently and leveraged differently in the media, right? A public safety frame often is not about the people that are actually experiencing addiction. It's often about other people that are not experiencing addiction and their fear, right? Or their right to some type of experience, right, in their city or town. Whereas a public health frame is more about people that are impacted by fentanyl addiction, right, directly, right? And those are so very different ways of framing the same conversation. So being aware of what those dominant frames are and those dominant messages, having a sense of the messengers that are utilized, like who are the experts? Who are people relying on to lend their credibility to an issue or an idea, or to validate it, right, in the public imagination? Who else is active on the issue? You really want to know who else is talking about this. If you are an organization that wants to become a thought leader or a spokesperson on an issue or an idea, you really have to have a sense of who else is talking about the issue or idea, and what frames they are lending to it, and therefore understanding how you can strategically enter the conversation in relationship to who else is talking. And then also, are there any openings or hooks for your organization or the issue? So I think a lot about organizations that work directly with youth and how a lot of our media consumption is focused on adults and adult perspectives on an issue. So any organization that works with young people sort of automatically has this really interesting way of talking about an issue and idea because it's coming generationally from a different perspective. So thinking about what is your unique sort of contribution to a conversation. Next. Again, with sort of media monitoring, when we think about this idea of knowing the reporters and people that are working on your issue, you want to know the journalists that are particularly influential. So, if there are journalists that are in your space that are quoted by other journalists, like if it comes up in one space and everyone else is talking about it, you want to know who those people are. You want to know who's covering the key issues for your organization or for your campaign. You want to know, who's following your organization. If there are journalists who are friendly, we call them the friendly journalists, right? The ones that come to all of your events, the ones who reach out to you directly about something, right? As a source, you want to be keeping track of them. And in particular, you want to be keeping track of how you can support their work as well, so that it becomes a mutual relationship. People who are interested in your point of view, and also just, I think, making sure that you're reviewing their work as well, right? Because you're also, you also want them to be credible, right? Credible messengers, credible, people who can deliver the message to your audience. So really also evaluating their work and understanding how strong their pieces are and also how accurate their pieces are. Next. So this is, my computer is very small, but this is an example of what you might build if you were to develop sort of a media list, right? And we would encourage you to develop and maintain a list that is very up to date, right? So you want to know, as we said before, you want to know who the reporters are, the journalists that are covering your issue. You want to keep track of which outlet they're working for. And importantly, you want to keep track of when they move, because journalists often move around, right? But the thing is, right, they're people, right? So they have this lived experience in a specific community or around a specific issue, and they take that with them to whatever new beat they have at whatever outlet. Their role, obviously, the beat is important. Like, what exactly do they focus on? So what are they paid to focus on? Sometimes people have a side project, something they're very interested in. You want to know that too, but you also want to know how you can strategically enter a conversation or support them in their work in a way that is aligned with what they're supposed to be covering, what their beat is, and obviously their location. So this is just a spreadsheet that anyone would make. And I've said this a couple times, like kind of like little pieces of this, but these are relationships, right? And it needs to feel like a relationship. Often when folks are being reached out to in the press and the only time they ever hear from your organization is when you need something or you need them to cover something, it doesn't work really, right? Like it's kind of, that's based on luck, right? Your piece has to be so strong. It has to be, uniquely timed. Everything about it has to sort of be special and pristine, right? Another way, which I strongly recommend, is developing a relationship with reporters and with journalists that enables them to both also to support your work, right? To show up in this sort of mutual way, but also often editors, if they have a relationship with you, will help you to understand where your work will fit in what they can publish. And that's the relationship you want, someone who's able to sort of help you to craft, right, and to frame your work in a way that serves your organization, but also is something that aligns with what they are doing, right, and what their audience is looking to them for. The last thing that I'll say here is is this part about promoting their coverage, even if it doesn't include you. I mean, and our colleague Mina, if you come next session, we'll talk about this as well. But it's incredibly important that they see you as also like we're both seeing each other as sort of tools or vehicles to reach specific audiences. And one way that you can show them and demonstrate that as goodwill is to also publicize their work, right? Or to link to their work, or to link to them as journalists, right? So something important to consider. And then the last, Meredith, we added this around the impact of COVID. And this is just about, I think mostly is about timing, right? Like there was a time when people were sitting in offices with all of their editors, and that's not necessarily the case right now. So kind of the patience, right? Like you can plant the seeds of a conversation or a relationship months in advance of when you need to leverage that relationship to push something out.
Yeah. And just knowing that, like with the economy, I don't know if folks saw, like, for example, last week, NPR laid off a big part of their staff, right? And so just to have some compassion for the reality of how newsrooms have changed, the media has been divested from, and that in that relationship building, right, that we have to understand that, yes, while we need them and our work is very hard, that journalists want to know that we're seeing that their role is changing and also very challenging. And then the other piece around this foundation piece is just being prepared. So we have all experienced, I would imagine, something happens and then we're scrambling to find someone who can speak to the issue within our organization. You're asking people and nobody has talking points, and it just becomes extremely stressful. So it feels really critical that not only are you planting the seeds of the relationship with the media and journalists, but also that you're planting the seeds within your own organization so that you are ready to go, right? So what does that look like? It can be, I'm starting with the second one for some reason, it can be a database, right? Or a quote library, so that, if you don't have, an individual person that's ready to sort of speak on the record, another thing you can do is have tagged or coded quotes. Some people, when they do either exit interviews, or if you're doing intake with young people, or if you have some kind of longitudinal experience with people, it can be helpful to collect quotes at different points in their journey that you can then obviously anonymize, but that you can draw from when media says, do you have a quote on this? Do you have something that you can say? Do you have a story on this, right? That you were already creating those stories and organizing those stories in advance. Photos are the same, and sort of other assets. The talking points piece, Meredith and I talked. We've done this in the past with young people in particular, is having a speakers bureau and training young people in advance to be able to speak to particular talking points, right, or to contextualize their own story within a set of talking points, and that's incredibly useful because they're ready to go, right? They've been trained. They're ready to speak on the record and understand. Sort of the sensitivities of speaking on the record, right? Feel confident to do that. And it would be the same for an organization, where we would recommend that there be some type of speaker training so that people feel confident and ready to speak to the press. So earned media coverage. So now it's about pitching to the media, right? So what does that look like, and what do you do? So we're gonna talk. We have so many questions in the chat. I'm going to let Meredith answer the chat, and then we'll jump in. So this is about the hook, right? We've all heard this idea of identifying the hook. This is that first moment when people, I'm going to use the example of the news media, right?
we see something and then we decide to scroll, or we see something and we decide to click, right? You got to get that hook, because without that, people lose interest, right? Or people read half of the sentence and walk away, right? So what is the hook? There are some different ways to think about this, but importantly, it needs to be connected to something that's happening now. Like, it's very difficult to introduce an idea or an issue into the public imagination or into the public discourse. So usually people find something else that's going on, and you try to connect whatever you want to say to something that people are already discussing and already have energy around. Timeliness and the urgency. So something that has to, something that has to happen right now, right? How do you infuse your hook with a sense of urgency? Importantly, obviously, if there are big names, right? If there's some kind of like marquee kind of level person that feels important or feels, has celebrity in some sense, right? That's also an interesting sort of way to create a hook. You can localize a national story, or you can nationalize a local story. So what does that mean? It means that if the entire country is having a conversation about fentanyl, which we've been talking a lot about, that's top of mind. I live in Seattle, right? So the fentanyl crisis, if you then say, okay, let's take this out of this national conversation and say, let's look at this specific community and what's happening to individual people. If you were to locate that national conversation in a specific family, in a specific block, right, and talk about people's names and what's happening and their experience, right, that's localizing a national story. And the reverse is also true, that something can be happening in your community, and you could, for example, partner with organizations in other parts of the country that are experiencing something similar and boost a national op-ed, right, that says this is happening everywhere. This isn't only happening in our communities. And then the sort of something new or a first that's happening, often that's around policy or programs or new data. Like a study comes out and you say, we haven't had data on this since 1992, and there's a new study, and we want to sort of announce this because it has particular resonance. With data in particular, it needs to be connected to something that feels urgent. Because data is hard for people already to understand. We're not great at numbers in this country in general. So if you are announcing data that's heavy on numbers, it needs to be connected to something that people have more fluency with. And then another side of a story that's being told, and I used the example of young people earlier, and I use it again here. Often the stories that are told about major issues that affect the country are told from an adult voice. So another side of the story could very easily be a young person talking about their perspective and their experience on an issue that has been widely covered, but has not been covered from a youth perspective. So this is just some examples of how you identify the hook. So some of us are communications geniuses, and the first thing that comes to mind is the hook. But for most people, you start with an idea, right? And then you have to flesh it out to create a hook that would be meaningful for folks. So on the left side in the blue, starting with a sort of raw idea, in this case, it's that Integra is to build a new factory in Ireland. And then you flesh out and you add some detail to that, right? And it becomes $55 million investment, which becomes very specific, to create 100 high-skilled jobs in Monaghan-based Integra, right? So what are we doing? We're infusing Monaghan, which is a location, so that if you are a reader and you're familiar with a specific place, right, that you see yourself reflected in this hook. We say $55 million. That sounds like a lot of money, right? So people like big whole numbers, and dollar signs are helpful, right? And 100 high-skilled jobs. What are we connecting this to? We're connecting this to a conversation somewhere that there's either a job shortage, right? Or people are in fear there's going to be a job shortage, but we're connecting it to a dominant narrative that people have that there's something wrong with the economy, right? And so therefore we need jobs. So then this becomes Integra to build a new factory in Ireland becomes a solution to a problem that people are already talking about, right? So it becomes a hook. Does that make sense? Some of you are on camera, like nod your heads or thumbs up. Does that make sense? That kind of difference between, like a little bit.
And if I can add the two others on the left there are sort of silly examples, but are actually the types of things that folks have asked me about in terms of issuing a press release. Like, we want to issue a press release about our new website. And while for those of you who've been working months and months and months on your new website, it's huge news. Unfortunately, in the larger media environment, there's a new website every day. Or something like, we know that it takes a lot of time and energy, and it is really big news when a coalition effectively comes together, but it doesn't have enough of that detail or context to feel like a news story in a pitch, right? And so that's even if you're trying to announce something that doesn't feel like news, it's about how do you hook it onto something that can actually intervene and catch the attention of someone who would cover the issue or write a story about it.
Yeah, I mean, to that point with the website piece is about reach, right? Like it's like there's a story in a new website. If the organization has been around for many, many years and has never had the money or the funding to be able to do this type of publicity or to create this sort of online presence, and how that website then enables you to reach a larger group of people, right? And then the data to say that that's actually what's happened as a result of the website, right? I mean, that's the other thing I just want to just say quickly is that in our new world situation, there has been some both capital and celebrity around funders, specific funders, individual funders, and just to elevate that, because that also is that is a conversation that's happening. So there is also a way to connect what you're doing to, a gift, for example. Like there are people who are giving money who also carry some of that capital to create a hook. So who will you pitch? So we talked a little bit about, I think we've sort of dropped in little nuggets about this as we've gone along. But this is just this is a table that you can use to sort of consider what might be the appropriate place for you to pitch, right? So the TV piece, Meredith offered this earlier, but if you don't have visuals or you don't have video, or there's nothing for people to come and see and that is compelling, then TV probably isn't the right place. If you were doing a march and you have thousands of people in the street and you have people asking questions and giving speeches, that's a great opportunity for television. National newspapers, again, is it of national significance? And I talked earlier about nationalizing a local issue or the other way around, right? Sometimes newspapers, one thing for the national newspapers, some of the national newspapers do, series or sort of more episodic coverage where they focus on specific parts of the country. So that also can be an opportunity to have a more local story, have national significance. Radio and podcast. This is about, if there is a show that covers your issue or features events. The one thing about podcasts that I would just offer is that podcast audiences are actually very, very small. It's a very particular audience. So being really conscious of who actually listens to podcasts and whether that's your audience. Whereas radio is broader, but also there's some, and you can look to find, Meredith and I will share some resources for you, but radio feels broad, but the number of people that actually listen to live radio as it's happening is both dwindling and also becoming very concentrated around age, right? So that would be something else to consider. Local and regional newspapers, right? Those are great, especially if it's immediate in your community, like, right, I want you to come to something. It's important to have sort of, broad coverage there. Magazines, the main thing with magazines is the cadence of magazines, right? A newspaper is daily and a magazine usually is a month to 2 months out, unless something, we've all seen, right? If something like either catastrophic or like something that affects the entire country happens, then obviously people's timelines shift with content, but often you would be telling a story well in advance of when it would be published. So there's a different sense of the timeliness of something. You need to have more, what is that? What do we call that? The horizon on the content needs to be longer, basically. And then trade sector and niche outlets. And this is around particular issue ideas or also around particular industries, right? So if you're trying to reach an audience, for example, if you're trying to reach business owners in a local community, there may be a business association that publishes a newsletter. And that newsletter is read by everyone who has a small business in a particular location. So that would be a necessary place for you to pitch. And the other is, there are journals and there are magazines that are dedicated to specific issue areas. So that's another thing to be aware of.
And also to specific cultural or other identity communities. So don't forget things like your Spanish language local outlet, your LGBTQ newspaper. Again, if that is where your audience may be, those are other kind of smaller outlets that often with those smaller outlets, it's actually easier to get coverage than, for example, the LA Times. So just a reminder about those as well.
And often those smaller outlets have, I didn't even finish the sentence, the smaller outlets have they're more targeted for their specific audience because they know them better, right? They're not trying to reach kind of this general, as we said, this general public, right? They're very, very specific about what their audience cares about, and they're more conscious of sort of their consumer trends and behaviors. So we're going to take you back to the worksheet, and I've talked a lot. I feel like we've been talking a lot on this, and we want you to spend a little bit of time identifying your hook and your target outlets. So we'll spend, how much time do we have, Meredith?
I think we're taking just about 5 or 6 minutes. Again, it's not that we think you're going to fully bake your strategy. It's just to collect some thoughts and think about what questions or roadblocks are coming up when you think about using this later to build out a larger media strategy. So I'm going to pause recording so we can put on some brainstorming music, and we'll make sure that we're answering some of the questions coming through the chat as well. Here, Zoom our recording. So we just wanted to go through one more section of ideas, and then we're going to open it up for a few questions. Again, these resources are available, and you can follow up with us with any questions that we're not able to dig into in detail here today. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about press materials, and there's 2 main ones that are often useful depending on, again, what you're trying to do and who you were trying to pitch. So first, there's a press release. And this is a short overview of what the news is that could almost be just copied and pasted into an article and reads like a story itself, because it includes things like facts from new data or quotes from spokespeople. If you're announcing a new bill that you're trying to pass, it might have 2 or 3 different people quoted talking about the impacts that the bill would have or the impact of your program. And you want to make sure that it starts with that catchy headline and what's called a lead sentence that really pulls people in to what's most newsworthy. Sort of that idea of getting straight to the point and pulling folks into the story. Then you may also need, particularly if you have an event or an action where you want to get folks out there covering it in the news, that's where you would use a press or a media advisory. And that is more of a simple, sometimes even just written in bullets, the facts of who, why, what, when, and where. And it's going to be much shorter, no more than a page. And for something like that, it may be where you might send it a week or 2 ahead of your rally or your healing festival or your youth speak out. And then right the day before or early in that day, you send it again to a reminder. Again, that media advisory is to get the journalists out to something, and then they're going to be covering the actual event itself. Where a press release might be more about announcing a new research study, a new program, the fact that your local organization is getting national attention, maybe that one of your leaders has gotten to go to Washington, D.C. to speak about this issue, right? And so you may need both of these things at different times. Then once you have those press materials, how do you make the pitch? And while it is more time consuming to do it this way, it is much more effective to send individual emails to each journalist. It can be really tempting to send a mass email or use something like the Newswire to blast 100 journalists at a time. However, a lot of times those mass emails end up in journalists' spam folders, or they will just feel like they're receiving a mass email. Versus if you say, "Dear Michaela, I'd like to talk to you today because of that story you wrote last week," and then the rest of it can all be the same. It's just enough of that customization, again, where folks feel like you're talking to them as people. About 80% of journalists say that email is their preferred way to get pitches. Although sometimes on a journalist site, they'll actually list, hey, I prefer a phone call, or I prefer this method. We also have seen that Twitter and DMs through Twitter can be, sometimes folks say, hey, pitch me, send me a DM, let me know what your story is. We know Twitter is also a rapidly evolving landmine, and so that could change. But for now, it has been a useful place to cultivate journalists. You want to keep it short. Folks are not going to read an entire thesis in your email. So you want to really just make it sticky and easy to read, where then the press release is below. And you want to keep it conversational. These are people that we want to have relationships. So try not to be jargony or long intros, just get to the point and maybe lead with a question that invites them into the conversation. As you then follow up and are trying to cultivate those reporters, think about how you can be persistent, but you don't want to be a pest. This isn't something where you follow up every day of the week, right? Sometimes we have to just put it out there and then hope for the best. If somebody writes you back and takes the time to say, no, I can't cover this right now, that is still a response, and that is great. That means that the reporter actually read your email and that you're cultivating a relationship with them. And then if they get in touch and say, yes, I'm interested, or they follow up and have a question, being very timely is super important. Getting them whatever it is they've asked for in a timely way, being sure you understand if they have a deadline. Most writers and journalists, they're reporting to an editor. So they're thinking about what deadlines and timelines their editor has for them. You also, once you're in that conversation with a reporter, just approach it as if nothing is off the record. Even if they say it's on background, every conversation you have with a journalist, it's just best practice to assume that something you say could end up in how they cover this story. And then if they write, you want to make sure that you thank them and that you amplify their coverage. Again, not just because that helps them feel like, oh, it was worth it for me that I covered this organization or this initiative, but it also will help that coverage get out there more, because most folks aren't necessarily getting their news from the primary source. They're getting it because it has been posted on Facebook, or because somebody has then made a little video about it on Twitter. So what do journalists want, right? They want it to be easy for them. They often want to feel like they're the one who has the exclusive rights to tell the story, or they're telling it first, the idea that they're breaking the news. And they want to make sure that they're working with folks who make it easier for them to stay on deadline. You want to make sure that some things that you don't do are to overwhelm them with either follow-up or information or data, or pitching them every single week, pitching them a new story. They're going to feel like you're just grasping at straws. And so you want to make sure you're saving those pitches for where you have real news and those types of things. And then you want to make sure that your press materials don't have typos, that you have the right name of the journalist. Those simple things may sound very simple, but they can really make a difference. You can think about, if you have a really big story, offering what's called an exclusive. And that's where you say, hey, Fresno Bee, LA Times, New York Times, we're offering you an exclusive, which means you're only going to let them have the information until a certain date and a certain time before you tell any other journalists about it. And that can be a really helpful strategy for getting an outlet to be excited to share your big news. You also want to make sure that when you're following up, rather than saying, oh, hey, Michaela, did you get my email about that press release? That maybe instead you're following up with something new. So, hey, Michaela, I don't know if you saw this morning's San Francisco Chronicle story about fentanyl, but it really relates to that event that I invited you to. Just wanted to make sure you saw it. So that, again, you're giving them something new to engage with as you continue the conversation. Then lastly, just a few things to consider. Editorial tactics are where you're writing something that then gets published. So that might be a letter to the editor. That often can be forgotten about. But if your local outlet is covering something and you feel like they missed the point, or they didn't include youth voice, or they had a safety frame where they should have a public health frame, submit a response. It might get published, and actually a lot of the folks who do read newspapers read the letters to the editor. Similar to op-eds, and I know that somebody had a question about those earlier, but most print outlets and online outlets have some kind of op-ed where on their site, they'll say, hey, here's how long we want them to be. Here's how you will submit it. Know that, especially over the last couple of years, there has to been more competition for these. And you want to make sure you're pitching your op-ed only to one outlet at a time. Because if somebody says yes, then you can't have another outlet also saying yes. And then with editorials, that's where you meet with the editorial board of the outlet, and they might write an editorial. Often this is when you have a campaign or a law or a ballot initiative, and you're trying to get them to take a stance on it, yes or no. We already talked about this, but again, making sure you're training your spokespeople. And that is just helping them understand, what is it like to give an interview? Put them on camera. Let them see what that feels like long before they're going to have to do it in real life. Think about, is there media you can make of your own? These are high capacity things. They take resources to do them well, so they're not always the right answer. But lots of folks are finding creative ways to create IGTV series or YouTube series. You may have a blog on your own website that you're using then to populate your social media channels. You might start your own podcast. These are all things to consider again, but they take a lot of capacity and resources to get off the ground. And so you may want to really think critically before you pursue them. And no matter what kind of coverage you're getting, you want to make sure that, again, you amplify it and you repurpose it. So you might have gotten this article. For example, here's a profile of the newer executive director of the Ella Baker Center. So they didn't just leave it in the Chronicle, they also turned it into a series of social media posts, because that's how you're going to get actual eyes on whatever coverage you earned, so that folks are liking it or commenting on it or sharing it with their friends, because we know that most folks, that's how they're getting their news. So we just have about 10 minutes left, and we want to open it up. What questions are coming up? What other tips or tools or effective strategies have you used in your organization or your campaign that you might want to share with the group? And yeah, what else is coming up for you? And I see this question first from Susan around, how do you amplify intentionally, right? So two answers to that. One is, next month, we're going to be having a session all about digital engagement, where we'll talk about, once you have that piece of content, how do you think about when to post it, how to post it, and how to package it for all the different channels that you might own, from Twitter to Facebook to LinkedIn, et cetera. But you also want to think about, so if you have this article or you have this radio interview, right? Not everyone who sees your post is going to go and listen to the whole radio interview. So how do you go through maybe that 20-minute radio interview and pick a really juicy quote? What was sort of the gem of the interview or the gem of the article? And maybe you might highlight that as you amplify and repost it, so that folks get a little taste of what the larger article is about, sort of a hook into them going and reading the article. Or you might think about, is it something that is it such a great article that you might include it in your email newsletter? We wanted to let everyone in the Elevate California see this great coverage of our work, and we wanted to shout out the 5 leaders who gave interviews, right? And so you're showing folks a little bit of how you played a role in getting the media, and then you're inviting folks to engage with it. Michael, I don't know if you have other thoughts about that.
I would just say that it's important to add your own commentary so that people understand what the relationship is to what you're reposting. So it's not enough just to post post with no context. As Meredith said, linking to individual people, sort of like, to celebrate sort of people's contribution is important, but it's also important to make it clear what your stance is or what your relationship is to the content that you're sharing, right? So it's content share and this is what we think about it. And then just the last piece around that is how do you, again, we came back earlier to this question about how do we connect the conversations people are already having. That's one way to do that, is to position this content share that you're making, this article that's been published, within a broader conversation by pulling in partners that are having the conversation and tagging them, or tagging a hashtag that is already evolving and is happening or is trending. To connect it back to your organization. Because essentially what you're trying to do is enter a conversation so that when it's someone searching for information about something, that you come up as part of this conversation.
I'm seeing a question in the chat from Sarah around using Haro, or these are platforms where you pay money, but then you get access to sort of a world of journalists. And whether those are useful to you partly depends on, do you have the resources to put behind them? Oh, Haro's free. I'm not as familiar with Haro. I've used Muckrack or Cision or PR Newswire. And so, Michael, I don't know if you've used particularly Haro.
I haven't used Haro. I've used paid services. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about when that has been helpful for you?
I think it's kind of shot in the dark, but on the things. I think generally I always try to do outreach to specific people, but I think if you're less familiar with the media landscape, you can use a tool to sort of canvas basically a larger group of people and see what turns up. The other thing though is for media advisories, where you're actually getting people, you want people to show up somewhere. It's less important that you have that individual relationship with someone, and more important that you get as much coverage as possible. So that would be a tool for what I would say is sort of broader canvassing. I do know that on some of the Muckraker and some of the paid services, and Haro I would assume is similar, you can do some kinds of segmentation around who you're trying to reach, and that can be really helpful if you're trying to develop a media list to understand who's out there. So that's absolutely an incredible tool for building that foundation that we talked about earlier. That would be my
and a lot of those services also can help you with media monitoring, which was something Michaela talked about. But there's also Google Alerts, which kind of can serve as your free media monitor. So investing money in some of these paid platforms, it really depends about how often is media going to be part of your strategy. And is it sort of a cost analysis, which we can help you think through, but really depends on the resources that you have. I'm seeing this question. Let's do one more question and then we can start wrapping up from Connie about how to engage audiences that are communities of color or non-English speaking. And there are many outlets that are particularly serving different language speaking communities. And those are great outlets to remember and pitch, particularly if you are then able, if folks who are monolingual speakers of a language come to you, are you able to answer their call? And are you able to provide services for them in that language? If the answer is yes, then thinking about those outlets that are particularly serving those communities is highly effective because they are trusted in those communities. A lot of folks forget to pitch some of the cultural or language specific outlets. So there's less competition than, for example, if you're trying to get into the Sacramento Bee. And they also can really sort of tailor the conversation you have for your community. So if you know your audience relies on those outlets, it is really strategic to consider including those in your strategy.
And this comes back in some ways to the very first thing that we talked about when we were sort of reviewing where we've been, which is after you've identified your audience, really targeting that audience and understanding where they're consuming media, where they're getting information, how they engage with that information so that you can right size your media strategy to meet their needs. Right. So on that list, on your sort of, that your Excel template or whatever it is that you're building that reflects your media relationships, on that list should be, whether it's the entirety of it or a small piece of that, should be a section that's dedicated to the outlets that are specifically targeting either people who speak a specific language or communities of color, and also communities of color, right? So specific groups within that term, to ensure that you're meeting people where they're at, and also ensuring that your content is coming from a trusted source, which is key, that people trust the source.
Yeah. And Arturo, yes, all of the resources, the worksheet, the slides, and the recording will be emailed out either later today or first thing tomorrow. So just to close the loop on that question as well. before we move into wrapping up?
Yeah. So a reminder that if you did sign up for the strategy workshops, those are taking place tomorrow. And we will be talking through some of the things that we talked about today around strategy. We'd love to see any press materials if you want to bring those our way. If you want to continue working on the worksheet, we can use our time in that way. But for those of you who have attended, it is fairly flexible. We are your consultants for that hour. So bring us what you're thinking about. The next session, as we've alluded to and mentioned a few times, our incredible colleague Mina Hussein is joining us. She's a digital strategist and a communication strategist, and she's going to lead our session on digital engagement, which is April 25th. She's going to talk about, digital strategy, but she's also going to talk about this last piece that we mentioned, which is, repurposing content. And I think critically important, both the timing and how frequently you post and how much of that is original content, right? Talking about the burden of creating content as well, and how you sort of navigate that and create a strategy around that. I think that's pretty much it. As we said, the timeline for our final session in May is shifting a little bit, but we will let you know through Shira where we land on that. We hope you have an excellent rest of your day. We're so appreciative of your attention and your participation and engagement. And we hope this has been useful and fruitful for you. Last thing, our email addresses, feel free to email us anytime with any questions that come up. We're looking forward to seeing some of you tomorrow, and we hope to see all of you at the next training in April.
So have a wonderful day. Thank you all so much. And until next time.